You're in the wrong elevator. The words landed cold against the polished steel walls just as the doors began to slide shut on the 43rd floor. Malcolm Hayes lifted his eyes slowly from the worn leather strap of his laptop bag and saw the man holding the elevator open with one hand like he owned the entire building. Tall, sharp gray suit, silver watch catching the white ceiling lights, clean smile with no warmth behind it. Ethan Caldwell. Regional Operations Manager for Caldwell and Pierce Holdings. The kind of man who looked at people for half a second and decided exactly where they belonged. Rainwater still darkened the shoulders of Malcolm's charcoal coat from the February storm outside, and his suitcase carried the dust of 3 airports and almost 14 straight hours of travel. Ethan glanced once at the old suitcase, once at Malcolm's shoes, then pressed the "door open" button harder with his thumb. Service staff uses the freight elevator, he said, loud enough for everyone inside to hear. The small group of executives standing behind him went silent immediately. One man stared down at his phone. Another adjusted his tie and looked away. A blonde woman near the back shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Malcolm could smell fresh espresso drifting from someone's paper cup mixed with the faint metallic scent of rain drying on heated concrete below the tower. He looked past Ethan toward the glowing numbers above the elevator panel. 43. The executive floor started at 40. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly when Malcolm didn't move. "You heard me, right?" he asked. "This elevator is restricted." Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows behind them, Manhattan disappeared beneath gray weather and streaks of cold rain. The city looked blurred, distant, almost underwater. Malcolm adjusted the strap on his shoulder carefully before speaking. "I understand," he said quietly. His voice carried no anger. No embarrassment either. That calmness seemed to irritate Ethan more than resistance would have. Ethan stepped slightly closer, lowering his voice just enough to sound polite while making the insult sharper. "Then let's not make this uncomfortable." Malcolm nodded once and stepped backward out of the elevator. The doors closed between them with a soft mechanical hush. For a brief second, Malcolm caught the eyes of the blonde woman inside. She looked away almost immediately. The elevator disappeared upward. Silence settled around the marble lobby hallway except for the muted tapping of heels and the distant hum of conversations from glass offices nearby. Malcolm stood alone beside a massive abstract painting worth more than most people's homes. His reflection shimmered faintly in the polished black wall beside him. Tired eyes. Graying beard. Coat slightly wrinkled from travel. Not the image people expected on the executive floors of a billion-dollar firm. Across the lobby, a digital screen displayed the company's slogan in white letters over a skyline backdrop, "Building the Future Through Trust." Malcolm stared at those words for several seconds before exhaling softly through his nose. Then he walked toward the reception desk with the same calm pace, while somewhere far above him, inside a boardroom wrapped in glass and power, Ethan Caldwell smiled confidently as executives prepared to discuss the largest deal of their careers, completely unaware that the quiet black man he had just removed from the elevator controlled whether that $300 million agreement would survive the next hour. The receptionist gave Malcolm Hayes the same uncertain smile people used when they were trying to decide whether someone belonged in the room. Her fingernails hovered above the keyboard as she glanced from his weathered suitcase to the executive elevators behind him. The lobby of Caldwell and Pierce Holdings stretched nearly half a football field wide, wrapped in marble and glass so polished it reflected every passing light like water. Outside, February rain crawled down the massive windows in silver streams while taxis sprayed dirty slush along Lexington Avenue 40 stories below. Malcolm rested one hand calmly on the reception counter. "Good morning," he said. "I am here for the investor strategy meeting." The receptionist blinked once. "Do you have an appointment?" Malcolm slid a simple black card across the counter. No gold lettering. No flashy title. Just his name in clean white print. Malcolm Hayes. The receptionist studied it longer than necessary before typing quickly. Her eyes narrowed slightly at the screen. Then widened. Before she could say anything else, her desk phone rang sharply. She picked it up immediately, lowering her voice. Malcolm stepped back politely while she listened. Across the lobby, men in tailored navy suits crossed the marble floor carrying leather portfolios and speaking in low confident tones about market shares, energy forecasts, and acquisition numbers. Nobody looked at Malcolm for more than 2 seconds. To them, he blended into the background like another tired traveler trying to find the wrong office. He preferred it that way. A soft vibration buzzed in Malcolm's coat pocket. He pulled out his phone and smiled faintly the second he saw the photo on the screen. A little girl missing one front tooth grinned back at him beneath bright pink headphones. He answered quietly. "Hey, pumpkin." The tension in his face disappeared almost instantly as his daughter's excited voice spilled through the speaker. "Daddy, did you make it to New York?" Malcolm walked slowly toward the windows overlooking the rain-soaked city. "I did," he said gently. "Long flight though." "Did you wear the lucky tie?" she asked. Malcolm looked down at the plain dark tie hanging slightly crooked beneath his wrinkled coat. "I sure did." "Then you are going to win," she said confidently. Malcolm laughed under his breath, soft enough that almost nobody nearby noticed. "That is not really how business works." "It should be," she replied. Her grandmother called for her faintly in the background before she added, "Come home soon." Malcolm stared out across Manhattan for a moment after the call ended. Helicopter lights blinked through the fog above the East River while rain streaked against the glass in long crooked lines. He slipped the phone back into his pocket carefully, as if holding on to the sound of her voice mattered more than the meeting upstairs. Behind him, the receptionist stood from her chair. "Sir," she called nervously. Malcolm turned. "Yes." "They are still preparing the boardroom upstairs." Her tone had changed completely now, respectful but uncertain. "Would you like coffee while you wait?" Malcolm smiled politely. "Black is fine." She hurried away toward a private lounge area normally reserved for senior executives. Near the elevators, Rachel Pierce stepped out carrying a tablet against her chest. She had seen Ethan block Malcolm earlier. The image still sat wrong in her stomach. Now she noticed something stranger. The receptionist who usually treated visitors like interruptions suddenly looked terrified of making a mistake. Rachel glanced toward Malcolm again. He stood quietly beside the rain-covered windows, holding a paper coffee cup in both hands, completely still amid the noise and movement around him. Calm. Patient. Watching everything. And for reasons she could not explain yet, Rachel suddenly had the uncomfortable feeling that the most important person in the building was the man everyone kept overlooking. The executive floor of Caldwell and Pierce Holdings smelled like polished wood, expensive cologne, and fresh printer ink. Above the city, the storm clouds wrapped Manhattan in a dull gray haze while inside the 48th floor boardroom, warm recessed lighting reflected across a table longer than most apartments in the city. Ethan Caldwell stood at the head of the room with the easy confidence of a man who had spent years believing success belonged naturally to people like him. His silver cufflinks flashed each time he pointed toward the massive digital screen displaying charts, projections, and the bold number glowing in blue across the center. $300 million. Every executive in the room understood what that number meant. Promotions. Bonuses. Magazine interviews. A chance to move Caldwell and Pierce into a completely different league. Ethan loved the way people listened when he spoke about it. "This deal changes everything," he said smoothly, pacing beside the screen. "By next quarter we will dominate the Northeast energy market." Several executives nodded immediately. One older board member leaned back with folded arms while another typed notes into a tablet without looking up. Rachel Pierce sat quietly halfway down the table, watching Ethan more carefully than the presentation itself. Outside the glass walls surrounding the boardroom, assistants hurried through hallways carrying coffee trays and stacks of documents while television screens flashed stock updates beside company logos. Ethan clicked to the next slide and smirked slightly. And thankfully, he added, we are finally dealing with investors who understand professionalism. A few people laughed softly. Rachel did not. Ethan loosened his tie slightly and walked toward the windows overlooking the rain-soaked skyline. You would be amazed how many people walk into this building pretending they belong upstairs, he continued. Confidence does not buy access. Rachel immediately thought about Malcolm standing near the lobby windows downstairs holding the paper coffee cup in complete silence while Ethan blocked him from the elevator. The memory sat heavier now. Something about Malcolm's calm expression bothered her because it had not looked embarrassed. It had looked patient. Ethan noticed Rachel watching him. Everything all right? He asked casually. Rachel hesitated only a second. The man downstairs earlier, she said carefully. The one from the elevator. Did anyone confirm who he was? Ethan gave a dismissive wave of his hand. Probably delivery or maintenance trying to wander onto executive floors. He said he was expected upstairs. Ethan laughed under his breath and several people around the table joined him automatically. Rachel, if every person with a wrinkled coat and a sad suitcase belonged in this room, we would need a stadium instead of a boardroom. More quiet laughter followed. Rachel forced a polite smile she did not feel. Ethan returned to the screen confidently. Anyway, he continued, the investors flying in today are extremely selective. They care about image, structure, discipline. The kind of people who expect excellence before they even shake your hand. His voice sharpened slightly with pride. That is why details matter. Downstairs, Malcolm Hayes sat alone in a leather chair near the windows while rain rolled slowly down the glass behind him like silver threads. His untouched coffee rested beside him on a marble side table. He quietly studied the movement throughout the lobby the same way someone studies a chessboard several moves ahead. Every greeting. Every glance. Every moment of discomfort. Near the elevators, a young security guard passed by and paused briefly. Sir, he said softly, almost apologetically, if anybody gives you trouble again, let me know. Malcolm looked up and smiled gently. Thank you, he replied. You have been kind. The guard nodded once before walking away. Malcolm checked the time on his watch. Upstairs, Ethan Caldwell straightened his jacket and smiled confidently at the room full of executives preparing to celebrate a deal they believed was already theirs, never realizing the quiet man downstairs had not said yes yet. By 10:15 that morning, the rain outside had turned heavier, rattling softly against the giant windows of Caldwell and Pierce Holdings like handfuls of gravel against glass. The city below moved in blurred headlights and umbrellas while inside the tower everything remained warm, polished, and controlled. Malcolm Hayes stood from the leather chair near the lobby windows and adjusted the cuff of his wrinkled coat carefully. Around him, assistants crossed the marble floor carrying folders stamped confidential while elevator chimes echoed through the open lobby every few minutes. Nobody paid much attention to him anymore. He had become part of the background. Quiet people often did. Rachel Pierce stepped out of the executive elevator with visible hesitation in her face the second she spotted him still waiting downstairs. Mr. Hayes, she asked cautiously. Malcolm turned toward her with the same calm expression he had worn all morning. Yes. Rachel tightened her grip around the tablet in her hands. I just wanted to apologize for earlier. There seems to have been some confusion. Malcolm gave a small polite nod. Confusion happens. Rachel studied him carefully now. Most people who have been embarrassed publicly would either become angry or desperate to prove themselves. Malcolm looked neither. He simply looked patient. That unsettled her more. The boardroom is almost ready, she said. Would you like me to escort you upstairs? Before Malcolm could answer, another voice interrupted from across the lobby. That will not be necessary. Ethan Caldwell walked toward them with controlled confidence, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the marble floor. Two executives followed several feet behind him, both carrying folders and half-finished coffees. Ethan stopped directly in front of Malcolm, offering a smile so thin it barely qualified as polite. "Sir," he said smoothly, "I thought we resolved this earlier." Rachel shifted uncomfortably. "Ethan, I think there may have been a mistake. His name is on the—" Ethan lifted one hand slightly without looking at her, silencing her mid-sentence. His eyes remained fixed on Malcolm. "This floor is restricted access." Malcolm held Ethan's gaze calmly. "I was invited." Ethan let out a short breath through his nose, almost amused. "By who?" "The board." Ethan glanced briefly toward the executives behind him as if inviting them to enjoy the absurdity. One of them smirked quietly. "Sir," Ethan said, lowering his voice into that careful corporate politeness that somehow felt colder than yelling, "this meeting involves a $300 million acquisition. This is not an open networking event." Malcolm nodded once. "I understand the importance of the meeting. Do you?" Ethan stepped slightly closer. "Because people spend years earning access to rooms like that." Rachel looked from one man to the other, tension tightening in her chest. The lobby suddenly felt too quiet despite the constant movement around them. Even the receptionist pretended not to listen while clearly listening to every word. Malcolm rested one hand on the handle of his suitcase. "I am expected upstairs," he repeated calmly. Ethan's smile disappeared completely now. "Listen carefully," he said. "Confidence is not credentials. Showing up in a borrowed coat does not make you an executive." The words hung sharply in the air between them. Rachel immediately looked down at the floor. One of the passing assistants slowed for half a second before continuing toward the elevators. Malcolm remained still. No anger crossed his face. No embarrassment either. That silence only seemed to frustrate Ethan more. "This company handles deals larger than most people will ever see in their lifetime," Ethan continued. "We cannot allow random individuals wandering into sensitive meetings." Malcolm glanced briefly toward the rain sliding down the massive windows behind Ethan before answering softly, "That may be true for some people." Ethan frowned slightly at the response, sensing something underneath it he could not quite place. But before he could respond, the elevator doors behind them opened again with a quiet chime, and several board members stepped out into the lobby, completely unaware they were walking directly toward the man whose decision would determine the future of the deal they had spent months preparing to celebrate. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and 3 senior board members stepped into the lobby speaking quietly about revenue projections and investor timing. Their expensive coats still carried traces of rain from outside while assistants hurried toward them holding folders and digital tablets. Ethan Caldwell immediately straightened his posture, the sharp edge in his voice disappearing beneath polished professionalism. "Good morning," he said smoothly as he stepped aside with a practiced smile. The board members greeted him without slowing down. None of them noticed Malcolm standing only a few feet away beside his suitcase near the marble wall. Rachel Pierce watched the entire moment carefully. Something about it felt unreal now, almost dangerous, like everyone inside the building was moving toward a cliff they could not see yet. Ethan glanced back toward Malcolm after the board members disappeared into the executive hallway. His patience was gone completely. "All right," he said flatly. "This has gone far enough." Malcolm remained calm. "I only came for the meeting." Ethan gave a short humorless laugh. "No. You came upstairs because nobody stopped you fast enough." Rachel stepped forward carefully. "Ethan, maybe we should verify with Rachel." Ethan's voice cut sharply through the lobby without rising very loud. "Please stop encouraging this." Several nearby employees turned subtly toward the tension while pretending not to stare. Malcolm noticed all of it. The receptionist nervously adjusted papers at her desk without reading any of them. A pair of young analysts near the elevators suddenly became deeply interested in their phones. Nobody wanted involvement. That was the way buildings like this worked. Silence protected careers. Ethan looked directly at Malcolm again. "I am asking you one final time to leave the executive floor." Malcolm's expression never changed. And I am telling you respectfully that I belong here. The calmness in his voice made Ethan's jaw tighten. To Ethan, confidence from someone like Malcolm did not feel dignified. It felt insulting. You know what? Ethan muttered. Fine. He turned toward the nearby security desk and lifted one hand. Marcus. The young security guard from earlier approached carefully, clearly uncomfortable before he even arrived. Yes, sir. Ethan kept his eyes on Malcolm. Escort this gentleman downstairs and remove his access badge. Marcus hesitated for half a second. Sir, he does not actually have a badge. Ethan exhaled impatiently. Then escort him out of the building. The word settled heavily across the lobby. Rachel looked visibly alarmed now. Ethan, this is unnecessary. No, Ethan replied coldly. What is unnecessary is allowing random individuals near confidential negotiations. Marcus shifted awkwardly beside Malcolm. Up close, he looked barely older than 25. Sir, he said quietly to Malcolm, almost apologetic, I need you to come with me. Malcolm studied the young guard for a brief moment before nodding gently. You are doing your job. Marcus looked relieved and ashamed at the same time. Malcolm reached down for the handle of his old suitcase while Ethan watched with visible satisfaction. For the first time all morning, the executive floor felt under control again. As Malcolm turned toward the elevators, his eyes drifted toward the enormous frosted glass wall displaying the Caldwell and Pierce Company logo in silver lettering beneath recessed white lights. He paused there silently for 2 full seconds. Rain streaks reflected across the polished surface behind the logo like cracks spreading through ice. Rachel noticed the look on his face immediately. It was not anger. It was disappointment. Quiet, deep disappointment. Malcolm adjusted his coat slowly and stepped toward the elevator beside Marcus while the lobby returned to motion around them. Phones rang again. Assistants hurried past carrying documents. Conversations restarted carefully. Ethan loosened his tie slightly, confident the distraction was finally over. But just before the elevator doors closed, Malcolm looked back once toward Ethan and said softly, a company usually reveals itself long before contracts do. Ethan frowned slightly at the strange comment, but the doors slid shut before he could respond. Upstairs, beyond the glass walls of the boardroom, executives prepared champagne for a deal they still believed was minutes away from becoming official. The rain outside had turned the sidewalks into mirrors by the time Malcolm Hayes stepped out of the revolving doors of Caldwell and Pierce Holdings. Yellow taxi lights stretched across the wet pavement in long distorted lines while cold wind rolled through the avenue carrying the smell of rainwater, exhaust, and roasted chestnuts from a street cart half a block away. Behind him, the giant glass tower rose into the gray Manhattan sky like something untouchable and distant. Marcus held the lobby door open awkwardly for a moment before letting it close again. He looked like he wanted to say something else but could not find the words. Malcolm gave him one final nod before walking slowly toward the curb with his suitcase rolling softly behind him through shallow rainwater. Across the street, people hurried beneath umbrellas without looking up. Business moved fast in New York. Nobody stopped for quiet humiliation. Malcolm paused beneath the awning of a closed pharmacy and rested one hand against the cold metal handle of his suitcase. Water dripped steadily from the edge of the awning beside him, tapping against the sidewalk in slow rhythm. For the first time all morning, the city noise faded enough for silence to settle around him. Not empty silence. Heavy silence. The kind that follows disappointment instead of anger. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone. The screen glowed softly against the gray afternoon light. Several unread messages waited from assistants, attorneys, and financial analysts asking whether the signing meeting had begun yet. Malcolm stared at the messages for a few seconds without responding. Across the avenue, steam drifted from a subway grate into the cold air while a delivery cyclist splashed through rainwater between honking cars. The world kept moving like nothing important had happened. But Malcolm knew moments like this mattered more than contracts. More than numbers. More than headlines. He thought about his father standing outside construction sites 30 years earlier waiting for supervisors who never learned his name. He remembered being 12 years old watching security guards follow his mother through department stores while she carried nothing except groceries and exhaustion from working double shifts. Some things changed in America. Some things simply learned how to wear better suits. Malcolm lowered himself onto a metal bench beneath the awning and loosened his tie slightly. Rainwater darkened the concrete around his shoes. Inside the building behind him, executives were probably pouring sparkling water into crystal glasses and congratulating themselves early. He could almost picture Ethan Caldwell smiling at the head of that long boardroom table, confident he had protected the company from someone who did not belong. Malcolm closed his eyes briefly and exhaled through his nose. Not angry. Just tired. Tired of watching dignity become invisible the second people saw dark skin and old luggage instead of value. His phone buzzed suddenly in his hand. Rachel Pierce. Malcolm let the call ring twice before answering. "Mr. Hayes," Rachel said quietly, almost breathless. "I do not think they know who you are." Malcolm looked out toward the rain-covered avenue. "No," he replied softly. "They do not." Rachel hesitated. "Should I tell them?" For several seconds Malcolm said nothing. Water rolled from the edge of the awning beside him in silver streams while traffic lights reflected red and gold across the soaked street. Finally he spoke. "Not yet." Rachel lowered her voice further. "They are preparing the final presentation upstairs." Malcolm's eyes drifted back toward the towering glass building behind him. Every floor glowed warm against the storm-dark sky. "Delay the signing," he said calmly. Rachel froze. "Mr. Hayes, are you certain?" Malcolm watched a father pull his little daughter carefully through the rain across the street, shielding her beneath his coat as taxis sprayed water around them. His expression softened slightly. "A company reveals itself long before paperwork does," he said quietly. Then he ended the call and sat alone beneath the cold Manhattan rain while far above him, inside a room full of polished executives and expensive confidence, the future of a $300 million deal quietly began to fall apart. At 11:12 that morning, the atmosphere inside the 48th floor boardroom shifted so suddenly that even the city outside seemed to pause with it. Ethan Caldwell stood beside the presentation screen halfway through a confident explanation about projected expansion margins when the double doors opened and the chief executive officer walked in holding a phone tightly against his ear. Richard Langley rarely looked nervous. Men like him built careers mastering calm. But the color had drained noticeably from his face now. Every conversation around the table stopped immediately. Ethan lowered the presentation remote. "Richard?" The older man lifted one hand for silence while listening carefully to the voice on the other end of the call. Rain pressed softly against the glass walls surrounding the boardroom while nobody moved. Finally Richard ended the call slowly and looked around the room with an expression that made several executives sit straighter in their chairs. "The signing has been suspended," he said quietly. The words landed like sudden cold air. Ethan blinked. "What?" Richard looked directly at him. "Blackridge Capital has frozen the acquisition." Silence swallowed the room. One executive frowned in confusion while another reached immediately for his phone. Ethan forced a short laugh under his breath. "There has to be some misunderstanding." Richard did not answer right away. Instead he placed a thick investor file onto the table with enough force to make several glasses shake softly. "Who," he asked carefully, "removed Malcolm Hayes from this building?" The room went completely still. Rachel felt her stomach tighten instantly. Ethan stared at Richard for a second before speaking. "The man downstairs." Richard's eyes sharpened. "You knew he was here?" Ethan looked around the table as though expecting support. None came. "He claimed he belonged in the meeting," Ethan said cautiously. "But nobody identified him properly." Richard slowly opened the investor file and turned it around across the table toward Ethan. Attached inside was a professional photograph of Malcolm Hayes standing beside the logo of Blackridge Capital during a financial summit in Chicago the previous year. The same calm eyes. The same quiet expression. Only now he wore a tailored navy suit beneath stage lighting while journalists crowded behind him. Beneath the photograph, one line appeared in bold print. Malcolm Hayes. Founder and controlling partner. Ethan's face lost color instantly. Rachel covered her mouth softly with one hand. Richard's voice lowered into something colder than anger. Blackridge controls 48% of the funding structure behind this acquisition. Nobody spoke. Rainwater crawled down the glass walls in silver lines while the humming projector light flickered quietly across the frozen presentation screen still displaying projected profits. Ethan stared at the photograph as if refusing to believe it could be real. "No," he muttered softly. "That cannot be him." Richard's jaw tightened. "You removed the man responsible for deciding whether this company survives the next fiscal year." One of the board members cursed quietly beneath his breath. Another executive immediately closed his laptop as if the meeting itself no longer mattered. Rachel looked down at the photograph again, suddenly replaying every moment from the morning in painful clarity. The old suitcase. The wrinkled coat. The quiet patience. Malcolm had never tried to prove himself because he had never needed to. Ethan took one slow step backward from the table. "I did not know," he said weakly. Richard looked at him for a long moment before replying. "That is exactly the problem." Somewhere below them, beyond 48 floors of polished marble, elevators, and expensive silence, Malcolm Hayes sat alone beneath a rain-covered awning while one of the largest business deals in New York quietly collapsed above his head. Inside the boardroom, nobody touched the champagne anymore. Nobody smiled. The only sound left in the room was the soft tapping of rain against glass and the growing realization that the most powerful man involved in the entire negotiation had entered the building carrying an old suitcase and left it treated like he did not belong there at all. The rain had slowed to a thin steady drizzle by the time Ethan Caldwell pushed through the revolving doors of Caldwell and Pierce Holdings and stepped onto the sidewalk. Cold wind immediately cut through his tailored coat while taxis hissed across wet pavement beside him. For the first time in years, Ethan looked like a man who had lost control of the room around him. His tie hung loosened beneath his collar, and the confidence that normally sharpened every movement had disappeared beneath something heavier. Fear. Across the avenue beneath the pharmacy awning, Malcolm Hayes still sat quietly on the metal bench with his suitcase beside him and his hands folded calmly around a paper coffee cup gone cold nearly an hour earlier. The city moved around him in streaks of headlights and umbrellas while steam drifted upward from subway grates into the gray afternoon air. Ethan crossed the street quickly, barely noticing the rain hitting his face. Rachel Pierce followed several steps behind him, holding her coat closed against the wind. When Ethan finally stopped in front of Malcolm, he looked smaller somehow. Not physically. Just human for the first time all day. Malcolm slowly lifted his eyes toward him. Neither man spoke immediately. Cars rolled through puddles nearby while a pedestrian signal clicked softly above the intersection. Ethan swallowed once before speaking. "Mr. Hayes," he said quietly. Malcolm waited. Ethan glanced briefly toward Rachel, then back at Malcolm again. "I owe you an apology." Malcolm studied him silently. Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment, struggling to hold on to the polished executive tone that usually came naturally to him. "I made assumptions," he admitted. "And I was wrong." Rainwater dripped steadily from the edge of the awning beside them. Malcolm looked down at the untouched coffee in his hands before asking softly, "What exactly were the assumptions?" Ethan opened his mouth but no answer came immediately. For the first time all morning, nobody in the conversation could hide behind titles or boardrooms or polished presentations. There was only truth left now. Rachel stood quietly nearby, watching Ethan search for words he should have understood hours earlier. Finally he spoke. "I thought," he stopped again. Malcolm waited patiently. Ethan exhaled slowly. "I thought you did not belong there." Malcolm nodded once, almost sadly. "Because of the coat?" Ethan looked away. "No, because of the suitcase." Ethan remained silent. Malcolm's voice stayed calm, gentle even. "Or because I walked into your building looking like someone you did not expect to hold power?" The question settled between them heavier than the rain-soaked air surrounding the street. Ethan could not answer it because they both already knew the truth. A taxi splashed through standing water nearby while distant sirens echoed somewhere downtown. Malcolm leaned back slightly against the bench. "You know," he said quietly, "my father spent 30 years working maintenance in buildings like yours. Every day people looked straight through him." Ethan lowered his head. "Mr. Hayes, and the strange thing is," Malcolm continued softly, "he still taught me to treat people with dignity anyway." Rachel felt her throat tighten listening to him. There was no anger in Malcolm's voice. No desire to humiliate Ethan back. Somehow that made the shame worse. Ethan rubbed one hand across the back of his neck before speaking again. "The board is asking if there is any way to continue the acquisition." Malcolm looked out toward the rain-covered traffic for several seconds before answering. "Do you know why I came here dressed like this today?" Ethan shook his head slowly. "Because numbers tell me whether a company can make money," Malcolm said. "But small moments tell me who people become once they think nobody important is watching." Silence followed. Cold wind rolled beneath the awning carrying the smell of wet concrete and car exhaust through the narrow space between buildings. Ethan stood motionless beside the bench, unable to escape the weight of his own reflection. Finally Malcolm rose slowly to his feet and picked up the handle of his suitcase. "I am not canceling the deal," he said calmly. Ethan looked up immediately in shock. Malcolm met his eyes one last time. "Too many innocent employees depend on what happens next. I will not punish them for your failure." The word struck Ethan harder than anger ever could have.